the first episode of the Information Management Revolution podcast.
It's exciting to be here.
What now? I feel like we should introduce ourselves, just for a little bit of context and tell people a little bit about us, our past, and where we are. Michael, do you want to have a crack at that first?
Yeah, sure. Happy to, Karl. Thank you. So yeah, my name's Michael Upton, and I call myself an information management consultant, and I'm based in Wellington, New Zealand, which is actually where I was born, unlike a lot of Wellingtonians. And I've been in the information management space on and off since maybe 2001, when I started working in a Melbourne commercial law firm on electronic discovery, and that's when I first started thinking about the management of information, things like evidence and digitization and things like that. But I've spent, I don't know, the last decade or so full-time in information management space. And I guess, I mean, in my world, in my life, I came out of IT, and so I basically only think about digital information. I mean, unless someone tells me otherwise. So I guess my context for thinking about information management is always digital. I was going to say it's digital first, but frankly, it's just digital. I can think about paper boxes if I need to, but it doesn't come naturally to me. I obviously, well, not obviously, but like many people, I use paper quite a lot to make notes and things. But in terms of thinking about management of information, I'm always thinking about, digital world. I've been pretty obsessed as a kind of self-publishing type, mucking around with websites and things since the 90s, when I was doing that in a text editor with no sort of content management stuff around it. So I've also been kind of I don't know, a much older person, a judge who was working on a royal commission that I was the information manager for, referred to me as a digital native, which made me laugh, given I'm in my mid-40s. But I think I've definitely thought about the digital world for decades, and again, that's kind of the context in which I think about information management. So, yeah.
And now you're a director at Metataxis. That's what you do.
That's correct. Yes, I should probably mention that. Thank you, Karl. So one of 4 directors of Metataxis New Zealand, which is a small consulting company focused on 3 different information-y things: information governance, information architecture, and information management. And I certainly come sort of from the IM background, but the more I hear about the IG stuff, I think, that comes pretty naturally to me. And I think you can't do effective information management without thinking about information architecture. So that also is something I think about a lot.
And that probably actually ties us in gives us a quite neat segue to Judi.
Yeah, indeed. Being another Metataxis person, I call myself an information architect. Actually, I just published a blog for ISCO UK about how we information architects use terminology so loosely. And sometimes I'm an information architect, sometimes I'm a taxonomist, sometimes I'm an ontologist. And in our profession, although we're here to help people manage their terminology and to understand what they mean by things, we are rubbish at tying down what we mean by the terms that we use sometimes. And that, as somebody was pointing out to me yesterday, is not a great look when you're trying to persuade organizations that they need to tie this stuff down. Anyway, moving on from that, I'm, as you can tell, a Brit, and I've been in New Zealand on and off since 2013, based in Wellington. And I can't remember, I think it was about 2009, somewhere around there, that I first called myself an information architect. But I realized that actually what I'd been doing for most of my career was that, indeed. So that even from the late 1980s, we were thinking about how to structure information. And it's interesting, Michael saying about not being involved in paper, because one of my early projects was a huge project for the British Library, putting their catalogue of printed music, doing a new version of it in, I can't remember, 60 volumes, I think it was. And we were just producing typesetting tapes at that point for these 60 volumes. And a smart guy in Germany said, don't you want to structure those tapes so that you can reuse the information later? And the boss of the company I worked for said, why would we do that? And then I know. And then I think it was only 2 years later, we all said, hey, listen, we've really got to do this because we now want to publish this on CD-ROM. We need it all to be fielded using mark structure. We need to have controlled vocabularies behind it, etc., etc. So the whole thing, one of my early kind of IA tasks was to analyze all that information and work out how it needed to be structured, not typographically, but for, semantically, so that we could understand it and reuse it. And that's pretty much what I've been doing ever since then, is analysing content, thinking about how it needs to be structured and described, whether that's a publishing project or a website or an enterprise, the whole organisation. How do they need to organise and structure and describe their content? So that's what turns me on. And just lately, I've been using the ontology word a lot because
it's popular.
It is popular. And building ontologies, and currently working on moving forward the idea of an all of government ontology in New Zealand, which is cool but scary.
Yeah. And the people side of that is going to be super, super, super interesting.
Yeah.
So I want to see how you get on with that.
Yeah.
I guess I'm the only one left. And so, a little bit about me. Look, my name's Karl Melrose. I work for a little company called Leadership Through Data, who do information management training at the moment. I've spent the last 15 years or so working in IT for a bunch of different organisations, and IM. Worked for Objective in the past, worked for a little trim shop based out of Perth in the past. And a couple of years ago, the thing that actually finds me here is that a couple of years ago, I've always had a real passion for this stuff, and I've always had a real passion for just generally doing things better. And I guess the reason I've ended up here is because I started a little blog about 2 years ago. I got very excited after one of the RIMPA conferences, and it's actually a complete nerd story. But I got on the plane and I had a Wi-Fi flight. And so I actually signed up for a WordPress site and launched it and wrote my first post on the plane between between Melbourne and Sydney, which nice. Was something that I'd actually been wanting to do for a while. I'd published a few little articles on my LinkedIn profile and done a few things like that. But what it came out of, and I guess the genesis of wanting to do this with the two of you, is that I just kept finding that practice seemed to get stuck at some point in the past, and it hadn't moved forward. And that may be controversial to say in some circles, but what I keep finding is that the organisations are wanting more out of information management than they're getting out of information management. And I think that's because of a lot of records practice that really stopped moving forward in the custodial era. And we always have this when we start talking about business process design. There's always that old saw about the worst thing you can do is pick up a manual process and then put it into an electronic system and try and automate it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But if you look at records management, that's really what happened. Yes. Records management really picked up this process that was really, really good for managing all of the paper that people were creating, because they didn't have another option. It was paper or nothing. And managing that electronically, But then we started to get electronic information, which fundamentally moves faster, is more agile. Copies are free, and practice didn't really move forward, but the demands of the organisations did. And I think that's been a real problem for records management, because I think there's a lot of records management purism where people think that, this is the job we're here to do and we're going to do that job, without kind of integrating that into the organizational context and saying, this is what the organization needs out of records management. And I mean, the great thing for records management for me, as somebody who is, I'm sort of 5 or 6 years into the journey, is that as I've really dug away at records management, I've found something that should have a lot more strategic power than it has. I've got this fundamental view, really, that we keep records because we've got stuff to manage beyond the capacity of ourselves to memorize the things that we need to manage, and to do that with any reliability. If people had 100% reliable memories that were evidence grade, that we knew we could trust, we wouldn't need records, because people would just remember, and that would be enough. But
yeah,
we don't. We forget things, and other people need to use the information we've created. And so that underlying idea of having things that we have to manage, and there being risks to managing how well we manage those things if we don't have good information to support them. And the number one risk being the risk of loss of organizational performance. A process that performs really badly because it doesn't have good information to support it. Like, that's number one. And so, my reading has been quite wide. I've read the standards, and I've read information and records management practice guides and everything else. And but the thing that I keep coming back to is just this idea of records management being a real strategic weapon, and it not being considered like that by particularly the government agencies that practice it.
You said organisations, I think I paraphrase slightly, but organisations know they need to do something around this, but actually, do they? I wonder whether some of them actually recognise that need. They recognise the need to have computers, but do they genuinely recognise the need to manage their information properly? I wonder about that.
No, I think that's entirely fair, and I think one of the things I would say from doing work in both private and public sectors is there's this real view that the private sector must get this, because the private sector has this imperative, has this clear commercial thing. It's like, well, if we don't manage our information properly, then we lose money, or those classic things of either we don't bring in revenue, or our costs bloom, or we screw up our risk profile. Like, those are the usual kind of broadly commercial things to think about. But in my experience, particularly large organizations can just get by on people in the right place fumbling through. And so unfortunately, maybe not even, but I do think, in a commercial context, people in the executive level should see the strategic value much more obviously, and want to actually manage their information well in order to get those kind of gains. I do think there's still an absence of understanding around that stuff, which I think, part of that is, even if people understand the benefit, they might misunderstand the solutions. And I think as a profession, records and information management ought to be able to deliver a whole lot of value that is not the same as other information technologists' skills. And so I think that's, I guess all I'm trying to say is that I think things get, if anyone identifies the issue, then they tend to think that throwing technology at it is going to be the answer.
Yes, that's very true.
And technology may well be part of the solution, but it's not, it's this even within IT, I shouldn't say even, I keep saying even, like, like this is brand new concept for anyone in IT, but in IT investment, you invest money in design if you want to get a good result. You spend the money up front and you work on the design. And I think that's exactly where information management can be a fantastic kind of lever or delivery mechanism or whatever. Like, basically, IM people can fully get involved in that design phase of a technology implementation to make sure that the solution makes sense. Yeah, but I'm sure there's many things we could say about why that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I think it's two. I think there's two transitions in particular that we're dealing with, and this might reflect the fact that mostly what I work with is a government client base, but
Yep.
I think there's two transitions, and I think one is records management moving from custodial to non-custodial, and and what we're calling kind of information management, really being the same thing. Information management's another label that's really come out of records management. It's amazing the number of people that I talk to where they say, and I had somebody at an agency explicitly say to me once, we don't want to do records management anymore, we're doing information management now.
Yeah.
And then go on to tell me a whole bunch of things that were as records management as it's possible to get without the label. So, I think the label, I think what it represents is that I think there's a group of people who are looking for something. I think that it's good for us. I mean, I think it says that people are looking for more out of records and information management. But I think that's the first transition. I think the first transition is that transition from, custodial records management to non-custodial, where, custodial, at some point, if you wanted to have more records, you had to buy more buildings to store them in. So, having a team of people who can manage that stuff efficiently so you can actually find it, but then also, get rid of the crap so that you don't have to buy another building. I mean, good business case for that. I think the other one though too is I think there's been a big transition for IT where, I remember, I have a long time ago, I did some stuff in IT. It was the first thing that I did, sort of straight out of school, and like it was hard. Like, to get servers to actually communicate and to connect to the internet and to get like hub-based networks with bridges to work, like it was hard.
Yep.
And it was slow and the service was crap. And even into the early 2000s, it was so manual. There was nothing automatic, and just getting things to work was really, really hard. And so I think IT actually had the same kind of legacy where it was so hard to get stuff to work that we put all of this focus on the technology because you just had to get it to work. Now, the interesting thing about that is that if you look at, that was 20 years ago, so the 25-year-old, IT graduate who was doing that stuff, is now a CIO or, senior manager in IT. And so what are all of the mental models they've got for dealing with all of those sorts of problems? Well, they're all of those problems about just getting the technology to work and just getting the technology in the hands of the people who need to use it. And you kind of look at, like, IT gets bashed in a lot of IT has a similar problem to records management in lots of agencies, talking to different CIOs at different points. They talk about a lot of the same problems. We've had our budgets cut because they continually have their budgets cut. And, it's that sort of thing. If they make a big investment, this is sort of the cycle that I keep seeing. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast as well is because I see this, you kind of have something explodes. So, either, a system falls over and loses a massive amount of information, and that's an IT problem. And so then big investment in new system and everything else. And then over the years, the investment in the system kind of trails off until the next, thing explodes. And I mean, you look at the funding cycle for records management as well. Records management has the same kind of funding cycle. It's right, Royal Commission or corruption scandal, ICAC investigation, something like that. Okay, bang, lots of funding to deal with it. But then over the years, it's almost like executives keep saying, well, we funded it to that level last year and nothing broke. And I also don't have a revenue stream on this side of the balance sheet. Or, I've got all these costs, but I don't have quantifiable benefits. So, you know what? I've got this other thing over here that's telling me they're going to deliver a 25% return on investment. So I'm going to just take some money off IT and records and give it to them because they're telling me they're going to give me a return, and IT is just looking like a cost. And I reckon, we can just, if I take some money, they won't spend it. And that's kind of what keeps happening in both disciplines.
There's also this driver of things coming out of support. So Microsoft aren't going to support SharePoint, I don't know, 2010 or whatever it is. So we've got to replace it. So what will we replace it with? Oh, another piece of technology. It's rarely driven by, actually people are finding that they can't do what they need to do. They can't find what they need. They can't manage their records, if you like, their disposal. Yeah. Rather than, it's much more likely to be about, is the technology still supported, than actually what is this technology doing for people?
So this is one of these things that I think is really interesting. I mean, if you look at the management, if you look at sort of different time periods of management, we back up 100 years ago, and what was really popular, it was Taylorism. Scientific management. It was this idea that, there was one right way to do things, and you could literally stand there and, you could time and motion study someone, and then you could figure out a better way to do the job. And like, you look at the performance improvements that they drove out of the back of the Industrial Revolution. I think that's actually something that's missing from information management. It's a little bit of, I keep calling it information Taylorism. It's stand there with a stopwatch and say, right, how long does it take to achieve this task? And you know what?
Absolutely. I've said that so many times to clients, because there's so little information about this. People say, how can we prove that this is going to help us? Well, do some time and motion. Set people these tasks, see how easy it is now, and see how easy we can make it in future, and then revisit it and get them to do those tasks again. And then you can prove to yourselves and the rest of the world, please, this is working so much better. But nobody ever, they often say, oh yeah, sounds like a good idea, but nobody
totally.
Everybody is doing it.
But the irony of this is that I've said this quite a few times, and then I was sitting down one day talking to somebody about it, and I just had this moment where I remembered something that had happened when I was at Dell, sort of 8 or 9 years ago. They actually had a bunch of Deloitte consultants come in at one point and stand behind us, literally, and they did. I didn't realize it at the time. They did a time and motion study of us, because we had this quoting system that we used, and everybody was always complaining about the performance, and to the point where they got Deloitte in to come and do a time and which I thought was really interesting, because Dell's a business that really thrives on that real operational kind of efficiency, and it's kind of the business model, and they're doing it. So is it just? And I don't know what the disconnect is there. I really don't, because it seems so obvious to me. But this is one of the reasons, I've been focused on this DICAR model, it's and starting to talk about how information management can improve results, because I think there's a lot of kind of I like to call it hand wavy stuff, where people say, oh, we could be so much more efficient if, but I was talking to a friend of mine who he was talking about FOIs at one point, and he was saying, we were just talking about why we do disposition, and he was saying, well, things like FOIs, they take so much longer if you don't do disposition. And I was sitting there talking to him, and we got to the end of this, and he's the agency information manager, building out a team at the moment, but team of one. And so FOI is part of his job. And so he services all of the FOIs for his agency as part of his job. And it might be, 15 to 20% of his job. But I mean, let's say, for sake of argument, because it makes the numbers neat, this person's $100,000 head. Well, that means that the cost of FOIs for that agency is about $20,000. Now, how much can you improve the findability of something before it costs more than $20,000 by doing disposition? And I don't think the numbers stack up. But I think there's a lot of, and the thing, and look, that was a long story, but the point of it is to say that I think executives see through a lot of the stories that we tell, particularly when there's stories like, well, we have to do disposition and we have to spend all of this money on disposition to improve FOI. I think they look at it and go, well, there's one FOI officer at the moment and they cost me 60 grand and you want to spend 400 to improve disposition.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I think they look at the numbers
How many
and say,
years
well,
would it take?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
it. But like, I think that, or worse still, I think people go to like Gartner reports and IDC reports. IDC says information findability costs organizations this much.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people go in and go, well, here's the percentage that IDC said, and therefore you should spend $4 million buying this new thing over here. Instead of saying, that to me should just be the start. It should be, here's some evidence that says there's a problem. Here is the long and quite rigorous and possibly arduous process about how we prove that this is a problem for your organization or not, which would be a great result if it's not.
Yeah.
But I think that lack of rigor in the middle there, I think that's one of the things that's really missing from a lot of it, and not all. There are people who get this stuff, who do this stuff, but I think it's what's missing from a lot of it.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I think
I jumped all over you there.
All good. I think a couple of things that come to mind for me based on what you're saying there, or what both of you are saying, is when it comes to like baselining and measuring basically the benefits of improving information and records stuff, I kind of think one thing that's really hard to measure is the follow on, the so what. So yes, you can use time and motion to measure motion. Sorry, come on, brain. You can use time and motion studies to do that operational efficiency side, right? You can say, cool, people can do that stuff faster, but so what? So what if those people do that stuff faster? Like, what is delivered by those people doing that thing faster?
Sure.
And I think that gets really complicated. And, I trust that mostly we're talking here about government and about public sector and so on. In that context, it is kind of challenging to say, well, what's the actual incentive, even for the executive, in delivering those benefits, in seeing that come to fruition. And I think that also fits in with this kind of the FOI or OIA, as it would be in New Zealand, that kind of stuff. It's like, okay, you can find stuff faster, or maybe you can't find stuff faster, but there's always these stories about, oh, we did this, we did an OIA, but we couldn't find the information that we were supposed to, or we chucked it out without having the right process or authority or whatever. We destroyed stuff and we got called out in the press, and it's that classic front page drama.
Yeah.
And that in itself is a really different business benefit or concern, or a driver, a trigger for change. Basically is that thing. It's more in line with what you're saying, Karl, about that investment cycle where you suddenly have an event that then suddenly triggers spending. Like, often it's embarrassment, often it's personal reputational stuff, or organizational reputational stuff, I should say, but those things are obviously mixed. Like, we're humans, and the exec are all humans. And so, money gets thrown around in those kind of situations. And I wonder whether part of the lack of sort of baselining and trying to systematically measure the value of what we're doing is because it's so seldom the reason that we're doing the work. Which is not to say that we shouldn't. Like, I think it'd be awesome if we could, if nothing else, baseline and then measure after it. Well, okay, that's just, I guess, what measuring is.
No, but it's really like, I really like what you're saying though too, and it's Liz, my wife, is reading Good to Great at the moment, and I've been a bit of a fan of Jim Collins' work for a long time, but the thing that keeps coming out of that stream of work is that it's this. He talks about this idea of a level 5 leader, and basically a level 5 leader is someone who leaves their own ego at the door and is there to just build the best thing that can be.
Right.
And you kind of need that person. I think it's a good point you make. I think, and you need that person who really is trying to build a great machine because they want to build something great that does things really well. It's almost like a craftsmanship kind of and maybe I'm romanticizing it or mythologizing it a little bit too much, but the people that, you know, there's one CIO in particular, who've, you know, he's been through a couple of organizations that I've done some work with, and everything he touches, he just builds brilliant systems. And I mean systems from the point of view of they just deliver really well to what the organization needs. And I wonder if there's an element of maybe it's leadership, you know, they're not focused on actually building a great system, you know, they just kind of want to deal with the troubles they've got as they come along. Or is there a problem that people have never seen what really good looks like?
Yeah, I think that's, and I think that really is a problem. And when people say to you, oh, can you point me at an organization that's doing this really well? Because I'd like to go and talk to them. And you go, well,
yeah.
to them, they do that bit quite well, or they're having some good thoughts about this.
Yeah.
Finding someone or an organization you could truly point to and say, that is, you know, that is a really good example of great.
Yeah.
I would.
And often it's easy to point at a fantastic practitioner, right? And go, hey, this person, has great ideas and or great skills, you know, but, you know, they've kind of been stymied by some random uselessness in their particular organization.
But that's stymied by some random uselessness. No,
it's leadership, right? I mean, that's what I think about. But anyway, keep going.
No, there's another dynamic that I think might be at play as well. And this is one of the things that I think is really interesting about information management generally. You know, information management gets out of control really, really fast. And, you know, anybody who's ever had to try and clean up something that's been done badly in the past, you know, and done badly, you know, can be all kinds of things. You know, we just chucked all this stuff over here because we didn't know what to do with it. Yeah. And then we decided we liked it organized differently. So we just created something new. And now we have 4 messes. The story, you know, the story of this one agency that does things really, really well keeps coming back to me. And, you know, they wanted to outsource a business process, and when I say wanted to, they actually just, you know, they had some problems that they needed to deal with geographic reach and some other things. And so they just went, well, it makes much more sense for us to outsource this process. And for them, because they had a brilliant information architecture and systems of record and, you know, everything was integrated, they just went, yeah, okay, we need to present this information to this group of people. And you know what? It's all in this core information management system. It's all tagged with, you know, with the right metadata and everything else. And so we'll just get our dev team to build an app that exposes the right information, and they can just do the work they need to do. And so they could do it. Whereas if they, and this is where I like thinking about records and information management as the strategic weapon, because if you were going to sit down and outsource that process and you had to do all of that stuff first, it would wreck the business case and you wouldn't do it. Because having to do a 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, you know, IT transformation so that you can outsource one business process, you know, 4 years down the track, like, I mean, really, who's going to do that and who's going to stick around for that? And I don't think you'd find many organizations that would. I think they'd look at it and say, it's too hard, we're not going to do it. And so I think what I've seen in the past from agencies that do it really well is you need the presence of that person who just really understands it holistically and understands that if you get the information architecture right,
exactly,
you don't and get it right and get it right is the correct idea, but the wrong wording. It's, you know, have a coherent information architecture.
Exactly, and do that for the whole organization. Build your map of the whole organization, the information for the whole organization, and then decide what your priorities are and what you need to do when. So this is not, oh my God, we've got all of this to do, now we've got to spend millions on it. No. But get your holistic view in place first so that you can, you know, do your discovery, understand what you've got, where it is, what's important, what isn't important, and then you can prioritize. But people just don't. They go, oh, yes, but this bit over here, we've got a burning need to do something with it, which may be true. but step back for a moment and see it in the wider context. Just a moment. I mean, I am talking a few weeks, not, a long
2
time.
years.
Just
Yeah.
take a moment to understand the wider view,
Yeah,
and
I mean,
decide where you need to spend your money.
yeah, and that's going to support that kind of sort of. Again, I'm losing my words for this stuff. If you think about information architecture and good information management as enablers, then it's going to be the only way that an organization can deliver the kinds of changes that Karl's talking about. So I guess all I'm saying is Judi, what you're describing in terms of stepping back and looking at the view of the whole organization, that's the only way that you can set yourself up to do a whole series of valuable changes that you can tie to business benefits, because you're not reinventing the wheel when it comes to the structure of the information, the grouping of the information, how you talk about it, how you manage it, how people use it, how machines use it. You can't do that over and over and over for every time you see a problem. Like you need to do that once. And I think that one of many opportunities at the moment for people thinking about information in our kind of professions, perhaps, is that, Karl, you talked about IT and the shift in IT, and I think the way that IT has shifted, where people are kind of procuring procuring services, I think it means that there is this whole series of incremental changes that go on now in organizations, rather than sort of bashing away at some legacy thing. And if IM folks or IA folks can make it really clear to an organization that solid foundational structuring of your information supports each of those incremental changes, then to me that seems like a really obvious case for actually sinking that money at the start into the IM and IA stuff, because it's like, but I don't think we know we'll need these many things to happen. Yeah. So we'll do this design piece, and again, it comes back. I mean, I just think about it again in terms of design, system design. But I'm always thinking of a system, and I'm sure this is what you were meaning, Karl, about that guy who does great systems. Is the system is not the technology. The system includes the technology, but it has to be people, practices, policy.
It's the whole bit. Yeah,
boring
the
old
system
policy.
Is everything.
Yeah.
But I think there's I think a lot of what you're talking about there, and this is something I've thought about a lot, is how do we make people quality sensitive for their information? And what I mean by that is that, I don't think we've had a good conversation with people in our own industry, with executives, with everybody about what actually happens when you raise the quality of your information. So, you have a Word document, right? What speed of movement is possible, what everything else is possible when you have a Word document. When you have some structured information there, or when you have a Word document that has some of the information separated out into different metadata fields, what can you do with that? And then when you have that as structured data, what can you then do with that? And I mean, even moving up on through the hierarchy as well, okay, so we have structured data, but now we have a master data model. What can we do when we move the quality up to that level? And I think we've been really bad at helping people, particularly executives, understand what becomes possible as you raise the quality through that spectrum. Because I mean, like I was kind of saying before, and like you were talking about, Michael, and like you were talking about as well, Judi, there's we've all been talking about it, there is so much more that you can do with high quality information. But how you get there, I think, is the really hard thing, and how you help people understand, and I think how you clean the mess up. But I mean, with low quality information, you're pretty much stuck with people reading things and doing tasks. With high quality information, you're basically presenting people with information and asking them to make a decision, or not asking them to make a decision. And I mean, how much faster can you move it? Yeah, how much faster can you move at different ends of that spectrum? the nice thing about that is that, you know, if we get to that end of the spectrum, then you actually have to have that conversation about, well, should we be doing it like this? You know, and this is where, you know, some agencies have got into big trouble because they've gone too far down here and started and you know, got the ethical part wrong. But, you know, that's actually an interesting something you've just
Yet
made
another
into.
million topics that we could do in future podcast
Oh
episodes.
yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, how many people do you see talking about the ethics of what they're doing with information, and they're still working with a bunch of Word documents? And it's like,
Yeah.
the ethics don't matter at that point because you've got people in the loop, and you know, but the ethics do
I wouldn't
matter.
say they don't matter.
It's not.
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
The ethics matter. The ethics, you know, you're not making a design decision where your view about ethics is now going to be baked into everything, every decision this agency makes completely automatically for the next 10 years. You know,
Yes.
you're giving people things on the spot and asking them to use discretion with the, you know, with the delegated authority they've got. But I think that quality discussion, that's one that I'm really, I think there's, between results and quality, I think there's food for a lot more podcasts, but I think there's, I think in a lot of ways that's the whole box and dice.
Yeah. I agree.
Judi, you look like you don't quite.
No, I was just thinking, I was just reflecting on, just thinking back, because I'm so old, thinking back to the days of, you know, you write your memo and you put it in your out tray and someone comes along and picks it up and maybe copies it and gives a copy to whoever needs to get it. But that's all really controlled, and I'm not going to be writing stuff that doesn't have an immediate purpose, because that's not the way we work when we've got paper in front of us. But now that we're using computers, I mean, we all know this, but, you know, you can just, how often do we write random documents or bits of documents that end up on the system and have no place being there, which you would normally, years ago, have just ripped up and thrown in the bin, but they're still there on your system.
Yeah.
So
well, where do they fit in your ontology? That's what I want to know.
yeah,
Look, I think,
exactly. Yeah, I mean, how do we deal with that end of the quality spectrum? You know, how do we stop people populating systems with just random rubbish?
we don't. Is the reality.
Sorry, what was that? How do we fix email?
Well, and there's that. But surely at some
don't worry, we just switch to chat. It'll be fine.
Yeah. Even more random stuff now.
Yeah. How do you dispose of gifts again? Like what?
Oh God.
I think, I mean, Judi, it's a fantastic point, and it was on my mind way back when Karl was talking about the fact we've shifted into this post-custodial world of records, is that the idea that information, and I think this is one of the reasons why people want to talk about information management, not records management, the idea that records, where we're talking about significant, you know, substantial records, that really matter, the idea that those are held separately to complete dross, like, you know, it's a nonsense, right? I mean, if we're talking about unstructured content, so if we're talking about Word documents and so on, and emails and so on, you know, all those things are mushed together in the same place, and there is a mindset of, oh, well, you know, put the important stuff somewhere, and we can debate that one in the future someday.
Yes.
but the reality of the everyday work is that people are putting important things with unimportant things, or things of long-term importance with things of very, very transitory, you know, importance, and putting duplicates with originals and and I think that is one of the really significant changes in the way, really significant ways that people's ways of working has changed, and therefore the practice needs to move. Like information management needs to accept the reality and needs to find answers for the questions of, you know, how do you sort the wheat from the chaff? Do you? Do you bother? You know, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And why? And I mean, you know, I kind of think like this is probably not telling anyone in the profession something they don't know, but I think there's this awful tendency to just kind of fall back to, well, you know, people have to do the right thing. They have to put the important stuff somewhere. And just like information architects might not actually be specific with language when they're just running around being normal people, information management people, you know, we're just as rubbish as everyone else when it comes to, you know, putting random notes and drafts alongside, you know, really substantial deliverables. And, you know, yeah, I think a fundamental kind of principle that's always in my mind in terms of thinking about systems and design of things is that, you know, we have to put user experience first. We have to let workers work the way that comes naturally to them. And if we ever deviate from that as a principle, because I'm saying it's a principle, not a, you know, 100% steadfast rule, you have to have good reasons for it. You have to have really good reasons for it. And I mean, I'll just chuck this in there because I've got to get this in the podcast, is, you know, I think if you put compliance needs ahead of user experience, then you will fail to be compliant. And I think that's been proven over and over again. So although it kind of feels counterintuitive for those who are really anxious about, you know, in a recordsy world, that I'm here to kind of deliver compliance, the way a better strategy for delivering compliance is to let go of that anxiety about it and focus your effort on letting people work well, you know, and then I would hope that the overall levels of compliance come through. And just to be really clear about what I'm talking about there, like there's this classic kind of way of working where, you know, you have your record keeping system, which is one technology, and you're asking people to chuck stuff in it, and you're asking people to use it, and you've configured and designed that whole system around your management requirements and your compliance requirements, and people aren't using it. And I'll pick an example of, no, I'm not going to name names, but someone I know really well. I asked her about her view of, you know, where she saves things in her government department that she works for, versus having had first-hand experience working in the information management team for that same organisation. And the information management team felt that they had a really great level of control because they were really happy with what was happening inside their EDRMS. Whereas, you know, this person who shall not be named was like, oh, I created a folder on my desktop and save everything there because it absolutely drives me nuts. So she was actively undermining the compliance stance of the organization along with the rest of her team, because she didn't have a system that basically helped her do her job. And so their overall compliance was the organizational compliance and what the information management team thought they were actually getting. Like, they were looking at the wrong stuff, they were measuring the wrong things, and they were not actually delivering any kind of compliance. So it drives me nuts when I see that, because I just think, well, what are you delivering then? Because you're failing in terms of delivery of compliance to an organization. So, you know, you're failing on that angle, and you're failing to actually help people do their jobs better by being able to, you know, either capture the information they need, create records that they need in the future, find those things again, you know, those kind of fundamental things, which, again, jumping back to the previous point, Karl, you talked about records versus information management. I mean, you know, part of records management, there's always stuff around access. There's always, you know, whatever framework you look at, there's always something about ongoing access to the information for as long as it's needed. And I really feel that gets missed when people are banging on about, you know, compliance and whether or not we're disposing of things correctly, or whether we're avoiding unauthorized destruction. It's like, but what about access? Can the people who need the information use it and use it meaningfully? Okay, rant ended.
No, look, honestly, but really good rant. And I there is nothing there that I disagree with at all. You know, I think the type of compliance is the thing that's super important, and how we implement that compliance. You know, and this is where I think this idea of moving from custodial to non-custodial, and the fact that we've picked up a paper process and moved it into a digital world comes in, because we still do disposition the way that we did when we were disposing of paper files. And What does that mean? That means we've got systems that provide an absolutely awful user experience because they're all configured around the needs of retention and disposition.
Yeah.
And that's not what people do work for. You know, people work in business processes, and you know they don't retain things because.
Yeah.
I think retention and disposition in its current form has done more damage to records management than any other thing we do. And I think the best thing we could do to move records management forward is dump disposition until we've actually got meaningful rates of compliance. And, you know, like I had an old client of mine who they got audited by someone, I won't talk about who it is, 2% of their corporate information. A federal agency that I worked with.
Hang on, 2%. 2% is under control of the organisation's processes.
So 2% was in their EDRMS and under systematic control.
Wow.
And you know, talking to a federal agency that were replacing their information management system a couple of years ago, you know, what was their estimated rate of systematic control? 10 to 15%. What was the number one problem that they had to solve? Well, every time our file server over here fills up, which is a completely uncontrolled system, somebody deletes a bunch of project files so that they can, you know, add the next Word document. And then 6 months later, someone goes, hang on, I need that because that's a program that was running for 5 years. And so they go back to IT and hope that IT have a backup that represents the latest information. Federal agency. And honestly, like the number of, particularly at local government, actually do pretty well, I've found, because they've generally bought an enterprise system like a Tech One or a Civic Authority or an Infor Pathway or something like that, and it's integrated to a records management system. So they actually generally do pretty well. They struggle with email
compliance wise.
Yeah. You know, records management compliance wise. State government, you know, I generally don't get better than, you know, people will tell me somewhere between 10 and 30% is what they think they're at. And I mean, this is, I honestly think that a large part of the root of this is because we've structured for disposition. We've been religious about function, activity, transaction, you know, which to me, like people just don't, you know, I mean, you know, anyway, I wrote a blog post about that a couple of weeks ago. You know, it just, like it just forces people into thinking about their job in ways that they don't think about their job. And the job wins every time. You know, the
first time I worked on an EDRMS rollout, my information manager, my boss at the time, said to me, you know, you'll come up against this clash between, you know, thinking about a functional classification and thinking about broadly case files, you know, broadly something that's structured around a subject. So either it's structured around a person, you know, classic client interaction stuff or personnel files or whatever, or it's structured around basically basically projects, you know, so basically around pieces of work and how they're thought about from a internal cost or financial perspective. So projects, which in theory, you know, BCS is blind to, you know, it doesn't matter how the funding happened for a function or an activity. So we should ignore projects in the sense they shouldn't be there. And to a large extent, you know, in a functional classification, again, you're not talking about the subjects of work. You know, you're talking about why the work happens, and or what you had the authority to do, what you've got the power to do. You know, whatever that is. So, why bring this up? Because this is 13, 14 years ago. Why it's really stuck in my head is because more and more I think that exception, that stuff around, you know, case files and projects and like that's actually how pretty much everyone works. You know?
Yeah. The biggest arguments I've had with people in information management have been around how project files are structured. And it's, you know, people who expect that the correspondence for the project file will be stored over here, and for the project will be stored over here, and the financial stuff for the project will be stored over here. And then, and the one that just killed me was having an argument with a consultant about the fact that because a project stage was a fixed term and a project name was a variable term, well, you had to have the stage file, the stages for the project above the project name in your, and it was just like, just made my brain want to explode. And then you go to every single project management product in the entire universe, and it is organized around a specific project. And
so Right.
How is information management broadly missed this?
I think that's more of an Australian stroke, possibly New Zealand thing, because I know you've got your FAT approach. In the UK, I mean, sure, functional approach, but that concept of cases, and projects are cases, aren't they, really?
Yeah.
They're containers.
Sure.
It's the same idea.
The start and end. Yeah, is a very comfortable idea.
Yeah.
So, and when I first looked at the function, activity, transaction stuff in Australia, I thought, yeah, okay, function, activity, I kind of get that, but transaction, and I've seen people take that transaction idea to an nth degree that just makes it's a real joke. So especially
I've sent an email. Oh, transaction.
Yeah.
Oh, but wait, is the whole thread one transaction? Who cares?
Yeah, what's the boundary? I mean, there is actually a good conversation to be had there about what the boundary is, because I mean, and that's where, I mean, maybe what we're talking about is poorly applied thinking around this stuff. And people wanting the world to be, more ordered than the world really is, or more ordered than the maturity of the thinking of the people they're working with is, and we touched on this a little bit before, that when we were talking about that idea, it was right back at the start when we were talking about the disciplined use of terms. I mean, so much of this stuff is cultural. I really think, when I started to talk to people about defining records, which was way back at the start of me coming into contact with records, people used to throw up their hands and basically tell me to go away. And it took me a while to figure out that was because there'd been this whole stage in records management where everybody had tried to come up with the perfect definition of what a record was that was universal and immutable. And so I kind of got that. But the problem that, I think we've run into is that when we haven't done things like define a record and then made sure that people in the organization were using the term correctly, I think what we've actually ended up with is everybody making up their own definition. And, well, I mean, this is why we have ontologies, right? Because, we need, where's the biggest use of ontologies, at the moment? It's springing up in health research. Because there are 14, every protein you talk about, there are 14 different ways to say the name of the protein.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And so medical research is electronically, you can't use one piece of medical research somewhere else without having a person who really understands the subject read it and translate it. And, like this, I mean, and you keep seeing this stuff pop up with different names, business terms models and, taxonomies and all these
exactly.
But it's disciplined use of terms with a thesaurus controlled. Exactly.
Yeah.
But how many of the problems that we've got come down to the fact that we haven't rigorously defined those things? And that was where I was starting to go with the transaction, just to sort of close the loop. It was... We can have where is the transaction boundary? It's almost it's a system boundary type issue. It's what's the boundary of the transaction? Well, is the project a transaction? I mean, you could make that argument. Project's a transaction. It's a bit, but
I don't think I would.
Yeah, I don't think I would either. But I mean, there's a maturity conversation to be had there as well. If your organization can't agree on what the definition of a project is, well.
Oh, yes. Well,
that's a classic, right?
It is a classic. And I can think of a certain organisation that Michael and I have both worked for, government agency, that seemed to have so many different words. Is it a project? Is it a programme? There were some other terms as well, which I can't luckily bring to mind now, for that initiative and those kinds of things. And you think, for God's sake, it must be, can you just not decide what these things are and just use the same word all the time?
And on the flip side of that, I mean, so many organizations where if you talk to someone and they say they're a project manager and you understand what they do, it's a million different things. It's a million different jobs and different ideas of ways of working. And likewise, I mean, just within project, a classic thing I've seen is organizations who need to do a significant thing every year. So they organize that and say it's a project.
Right.
Whereas I think a repeated significant activity that is always going to come up, say, I mean, an audit's a weird idea, but I don't know, doing your annual report, the development of my annual report, would you call that a project? I mean, to me, that that doesn't.
It's a process.
No.
Yeah, it's a process. It's a process that happens once a year.
Yeah.
It's just got different sort of timing around it, but that's a classic one where and what I was kind of thinking about when I was sort of saying projects, like a functional view of information would normally leave out projects. Like I think of projects as a way of kind of flagging how things have been funded and are being managed internally.
Yeah.
You know,
It's,
rather than actually saying something significant about the information. But it's, I mean,
but classification should be a catalytic act, as in we should classify things to drive an activity of some kind. I was running through SharePoint lists with someone last night who, you know, hasn't had much to do with them, and just showing them some of the things that I use. But every data point I've got in all these SharePoint lists drives an action or enables an action. I think we've got like classification is like that. So if you classify something as a project, what does that mean the organisation does? Well, the organisation follows this funding process. They appoint a project manager. They have a steering group. They do these things. And so if you want to call this a project, then these are the things that happen. But if you want to call it an initiative, and I mean, you know, then of course you just end up with people saying, well, we need to do this piece of work, but we don't quite have the funding for it. So let's just not classify it as a project. Let's call it an initiative.
Well, okay, but then
we come back to reality and humans.
Can we just agree that that's what it is?
Yes. But I mean, that to me, you know, that's like classification is a super powerful, you know, again, that's what I keep coming back to this in records management. You know, so many of these things we've got are just, they are absolute strategic weapons used the right way. But I don't think we've fought the right fights, and I don't think we've, and you know, we as a professional group,
not just us three.
We're here to fight the fight, or at least to talk about fighting the fight. And you know, after this, we'll form a committee, you know, to discuss the continuation of the fight, and then a subcommittee to.
Who's with me?
In the best traditions of bureaucratic organisations, and then we will need an ontology, and in 5 years' time, you know, we'll take action.
Absolutely.
And then I'll petition the regulator to do something for me. Sorry.
Well, actually, no, but you got onto one of the topics that I wanted to get onto before, and this is when I was talking about the type of compliance, because I think that really matters. You know, one of the things that I found, like let's look at regulators. You know, state records. In one particular state, who one CIO, and this is as close to a direct quote as my memory can remember. What are they going to do? Come down here and hit me with a lettuce leaf, for ask me to do it nicely again, or it was something like it. The lettuce leaf was hit me with a lettuce leaf that is a direct quote, and then Austrac.
Good, you want to go and throw loads of lettuces at him, don't you? Just
deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, everyone says that till someone throws a really big cos lettuce at you, and it hits you right.
Exactly.
Surely an iceberg.
But you look at Austrac, right? You know, Austrac, it's the Australian Transactions Analysis and Reporting Centre over here. It's counter-terrorism and anti-money laundering stuff.
Yep.
They find the Commonwealth Bank. They find one of the banks $785 million.
Wow.
Because there was a, and you don't know how these things happen, but basically what happened was that there was some reporting on their ATMs that wasn't functioning correctly, and it wasn't functioning correctly over a long period of time. So, people could go and, withdraw $1,000 10 times or something like that. And whatever the technicalities of it were, they find whatever bank it was, $785 million. Like, I've never been able to find revenue from fines in any one of state records reports, and I have looked for it. I don't see them audit anymore. Most of them won't audit.
One thing I'd say about that, though, is that I think politically it's a weird scenario to find, to be a government agency and to find another branch of government. Like, what does that say to the public? Like, what does that say in terms of tax revenues that they're basically just being passed around between organisations? Like, what happens with that fine?
Yeah, but it says that the agency takes its business seriously.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I don't care about the money, you know, if it was 10 cents, like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
if there was a dollar, if there, you know, if every fine was 10 cents and there was $1 of fines, and those fines cost, you know, $10,000 each to levy. So, you know, the loss on those fines was $9,999.90. I would still be really happy to see them there with the
Right.
names of the
Yeah.
agencies that have been fined next to them, you
Yeah.
know, because we've got, you know, we have a whole profession full of people working in government who go out there every day. And, you know, records and information management people are super passionate about what they do. I mean, look at the three of us for starters.
Yeah.
But, you know, we're not an isolated phenomenon. You know, the number of people who I have conversations with at conferences, and, you know, they get really frustrated, and they just say, you know, they say things like, you know, if only they just let us show them what we could do, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
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 But then they come in and they say, we'd love to do all these things, but, you know, we have this compliance bar that we've got to jump, and the compliance bar is up here, and the maturity level of the organization is down here. And it's not acceptable to say, well, we're just not going to have a compliance system for, you know, the next 10 years while we get the organization to a level where they can do this, you know, where our
Yeah.
information is well enough organized and those sorts of things. And so you've got a whole bunch of people who implement very compliant systems and have all of the policy and procedures, and it has about as much force and as much you know, power to actually get implemented as the lettuce leaf, you know, that we were just describing. And I mean, like, that is a direct quote from a government CIO. I mean, that's how they think about it. And and this agency, that, like, to be really just clear, this agency has brilliant information management. Like, they've got people who are really well, you know, people their information management system, you know, it's one of the old guard, you know, and people love it, use it religiously.
Wow.
You know, it's organized really well. They've had a string of really good information managers through there who have organized it really well, but they just look at it and say, well, the authority that we actually care about is the coroner's court, you know, in this particular.
Interesting.
And so, you know what, we do amazing information management because we're going to have to front up to that at some point when somebody gets killed. And, you know, in the particular area that they regulate, that happens not frequently, but often enough that, you know, you don't want a problem there. And so they're building other systems. But, you know, if you like, Kara released a Microsoft 365, you know, functional requirements report back in October, which I think I sent you, Michael, earlier in the week.
Yeah.
And like, you read through.
Sorry, I need to go to the loo. I can come back.
All right. Do you want to pause for a second?
Yeah, I'll come back.
Go.
Cool. All right. We'll just cut this bit out.
Yeah. I think you should leave it in.
Yeah, I know. Well, but yeah, I mean, I think we should too. This will be good. But, you know, I mean, you can do a find that report. You can do a find and replace on it. Like, there's an information manager over in New South Wales at one of the local councils there, and he had this weird string he went through where, you know, he's moved into a new council, or actually a couple of councils got amalgamated, and one of the incoming councils had not been doing information management well for quite a while, and so, you know, they started to find all of these cupboards that, you know, had all these records in it, and so he had a contractor that he used, and he'd ring this contractor, and the contractor would say, "Oh, I found another cupboard. Have you?" And he'd go, "Yeah," and then it was toilets. This string of toilets that had just been, you know, they just started to pile record boxes of records.
Oh no, really?
Yeah, and the toilets, and then it moved on to shower blocks.
Yeah.
And it was this string of finding shower blocks that had just been, you know, decommissioned because, you know, they'd stopped offering some kind of service through that place, and they just started to fill it up with records. You know, oh, that's where we'll put the records. And so it was just this string. Why I'm saying this, though, is because, like, this Kara functional requirements spec, I mean, you could find and replace Microsoft 365 with shower blocks, and it would actually be just as applicable.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Because it's, you know, 16175 focused, and, you know, it's all these things you must do, but, you know, you can't do all that stuff in a relational database. You know, there's all of these elements that, I was just telling my story about Kara, which is that, you could do a find and replace of Microsoft 365 with shower blocks. And I had this information manager that kept, he kept finding shower blocks full of records. It was just this weird phase he went through. But you could do a find replace with shower blocks and it would be just as applicable because it's 16175 focused. And it's just a whole bunch of things that you must. But the problem is that you can't do a lot of the things they're asking you for in a relational database without some serious gymnastics, or the business systems that, an agency wants to move to don't quite do all those things, yet the benefits to the agency and the quality of the information and the quality of business process they can run in those systems goes through the roof. And so there's no trade-offs in the compliance regime that we've got. There are no trade-offs allowed. It's not, don't keep that piece of metadata if the quality of your information will double by making this change. And to be fair to all of the regulators, they're moving in that direction. Like, South Australia, which was famous for having the most, prescriptive everything for a really long time, is now, their information management plan is down to about, it's down to like 6 requirements. And, it's the really basic stuff that, is actually just good information management practice. That's what they're telling agencies they need to do. You need to manage it proactively. You need to do a bunch of other things. And I see this as the same things happening. National Archives here have backed right off and said, well, 3 mandatory pieces of metadata now, 7 pieces of metadata if you want to do an interagency transfer. Down from, they were like at Dublin core levels. I think Dublin core, the minimum is like 14 and, the full thing is 40. And, I think SARCMs, which is South Australian record keeping metadata standards, used to be 115 or something like that. And just implementing that.
So I think one thing I'd like to add on that, and just on that specific point, is I'm trying to think what you were saying about this earlier, Karl. But if we think about information, oh damn it, sorry, I'm just trying to remember what example you gave. Anyway, okay, I'll let the example go.
Outsourcing a business process. I think that was something I was talking about.
That's just something you were talking about, but it's not the thing I was thinking of.
Yeah.
No, but in terms of understanding sort of implementability of things, I feel that that's a classic thing that if you have a kind of purist or perfectionist view of the world, it's really easy to think that in implementation within a technology, I must tick every single box, and then to see that the technology can't do it. And so you spend all this effort, like sinking time into kind of trying to go, oh, I must apply the 115 fields or whatever that I've been told I must apply, when the reality is the technology that was selected for it, that perhaps is out of your hands, can never do that thing. And I feel like there's a huge amount of effort and time wasted in wishing the world were different to how it is. And I think if I wind all the way back to Judi, what you were saying about thinking about sort of an enterprise information architecture and understanding your information at that level, having that little pause where you go, all right, well, what have we got out there? That gives you this kind of this understanding that your sort of your architecture and your systems view and your sort of tool set that you've got is about modeling your organization and the information in the organization and describing what you do and what you have, and that is a model which is separate to an implementation.
Yes, absolutely. So, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think if you take too literal a view of any of these standards and things, then you kind of you feel like the implementation must always look exactly the same, and it must always look like that enterprise view as prescribed. So the enterprise view as prescribed by the standards, And I think, well, I mean, I don't know. I just think it causes drama. It causes confusion, and it causes effort to be sunk into the wrong things. Like
there is an interesting sort of balancing issue there that you're talking about though too, which is the balance between prescription and description.
Mm-hmm.
And you
Yeah,
know, it's
sure.
that are we building a system to describe what, and you know, anytime you make a change in an organization, you know, you create something that prescribes what the organization should do in the hope that in the future it will describe what they are doing.
Yep.
But I think there's been a really long history of doing things that prescribe a way of doing things that the organization's just never going to do.
Never going to do. Yeah.
Yeah. And
yeah. And I guess all I'm saying is, sorry, Judi, just one specific part of that is that the tools that are being selected might be the reason that you can't do that thing. So, for instance,
or the standards.
Yeah, for sure. So the standards can be a reason that you know, the people are never going to do that thing. I'm just thinking like in the world of kind of picking software as a service products off the shelf or whatever, you go, cool, I'm going to get this recruitment app that's going to manage my recruitment process from start to finish. And it might do all that stuff really well, but
it's not compatible with ISO 16175 standards for record keeping in electronic office environments.
Hell no. And why pick a fight as an information manager or as an information architect in trying to actually bash at that implementation, like that technology, to try and change it, versus, you know, stepping back and going, well, what's my organization view and how much effort do I actually need to sink into making this recruitment process compliant? Like, how important are recruitment records versus, I don't know, you know, the core functions of the business?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I think that's all a bit muddly. It's about a million different points at once, but basically,
there's a big quality thing there too. Like what happened? Well, there's a big quality thing there too. Sure. What happens when you change that level of quality? You know, okay, what happens? You know, if 16175 full compliance is up here, and you know, practice today is down here. Well, what happens when you hit that top level? You know, is this the all singing, all dancing? You know, you've got an ontology that really describes what, you know, the state of your information really well. So you can automate everything. You can use all these, you know, fantastic whiz bang AI tools to do amazing things with your data. And is that what happens when you hit 16175? Or because I don't think it is.
Nope. Yeah. So I mean,
Judi, I feel like you had like 14 points that you wanted to put in there, and I feel like
sorry,
I was
got excited.
I was thinking about your information architecture. Of course, I would, wouldn't I? And what you've got and how that makes sense to be grouped in future. But also, the other thing that you need to do is really understand how your users want to use that or interact with that information. So that goes back to Michael's point, I think, right, you know, fairly near the beginning. It's understanding your users, what they need, not necessarily understanding their current processes, because the processes may not be good, but what do they actually need?
Yeah.
And that can be really hard, because if you're used to working in a particular way, then you don't necessarily, it can be hard to think outside of that in terms of, well, if I just, for example, in an IA context, if I could just look for things in this way, that's what I really want to do. Is hard when the only way you can look for things is in this way. So finding ways to free people's minds a bit and understand what it is they're actually trying to do and what would really help them. But that does take effort.
I think you've hit a perfect point there too, because I think that one of the problems of records management systems is that we want them to be perfect before we implement them. And the problem with that is that, you know, there's no test and learn in records management systems. You know, there's no A/B testing of classification schemes and those sorts of things, which is, you know, where that post about IA came from. You know, I just want people to go out and think about, you know, testing and those sorts of things. And I think the problem with that is that we take a lot of shortcuts because of that. And I actually think, function, activity, transaction, and a lot of the thinking around that, I think a lot of that actually comes from the fact that it's often done by consultants or people who are implementing a system, and they need a nice, neat project. And so, we have this much time for a design engagement, which means that we can do this much. And we know that a client's not going to pay for, for us to have an information architect in the organization for 2 to 3 years, so that they can build something and then come back to a team and say, is this working? And then do the work to change it so that it, describes what they do really well.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. So you typically get implementation partners who have this cookie cutter way of doing things. And if that doesn't, well, they're probably not even that interested in what would really work for you, because this is the way they do it.
They've got a project to do.
They've got a project to do. And
they've got to manage their cost versus,
Exactly. It brings me to another point that I wanted to discuss with you, this concept of minimum viable products when we get to information management. And do you think that works in that context?
Amazing. Yeah.
I know
I can show you my. I think we're using MVP everywhere in information management. A file server is minimum viable product.
Let alone information management. But yes.
Yeah,
I mean
the file server is
in
minimum
real
viable
life,
product.
like in real
yeah,
life.
No, I mean in production. Like,
yeah,
how many organizations do you go to where someone's just gone, need a bucket to put this stuff in? So, file server over there, create a file, bang, there it is. I mean, that's the MVP of the information management world, And like my SharePoint lists, they're minimum viable products. They're, what's the smallest unit that we can create something useful, that we can do something useful with.
And people say to me, can we have an MVP taxonomy? And I go, well, what do you want? Something with 10 terms in it, maybe. Yeah, that'll work.
Pick some obvious stuff out of Dublin Core and put some values in it. There you go.
Yeah, but that idea, like, I think if you, it's like people are obsessed with, the whole terms from agile and terms from, the sort of startup world at the moment. Yeah. And actually, the lean startup. The lean startups are brilliant, but I really, I do love that approach, and I think that if more people use that approach, I think we would actually have better information management than we've got. What's the next most valuable thing that you can do? And I mean, honestly, I've got a friend of mine who, this is why a taxonomy with one term could make a massive difference to an organization. I've got a friend of mine who, I've got a friend of mine who, serious IM long-termer, done brilliant work, has lectured, at different universities. She's excellent. She's taught me so much about it. But, she told me a story one day, an organization that she was in, and, executive sponsor gets up and says, and this is when she's about 12 months into her program, executive sponsor gets up and says, emails aren't records. Records is just the paper. And that completely derailed any chance that she had of being successful in that program, in my opinion. And I need to have a chat to her before we put this up live, because I may have to just snip this bit out. But in that organization, a taxonomy of one term, record, would have actually kept her whole program on track, because what you actually had was you had a person who was funding the program who was using terminology and had a different understanding of what the terminology meant to her operating view. And like, her operating view is an expansive view. She looks at things and says, you just have to manage everything as a record. At the end of the day, because if you start relying on people to make decisions about, when things rise to the level of a record, well, you end up with completely subjective responses, and you just end up in nothing's a record or everything's a record, and you might as well start with everything, because then you can make better decisions.
Yeah,
but
it's some of the records you can get rid of quickly. But
exactly. Those records, retention period 1 day.
Yeah.
but you know, I mean, that, like, a taxonomy of one term would have been a valuable MVP for that program, and would have kept that program on the rails. And, like, this is why I think, like, classification, like, it has to be catalytic. It has to drive people to do things, because when it does, you know, and that's what taxonomy, you know, for me, that's why it's should be such a value. And, you know, whatever word we want to use to describe it, you know,
Sure.
business terms, models are a little bit fashionable at the moment. You know, whatever we use to do it, you know, having an organizationally agreed definition of this is what that thing is, and this is what we do when we have that thing.
Yeah.
Like, I think you can do tons of MVPs of one term, and, you know, maybe the next MVP is, you know, I don't know. What would you move on to from there? What's the next most valuable thing to define in an information management program?
I guess, I mean, what it kind of brings up for me, apart from feeling slightly scarred and wanting to hide in the corner, is that earlier Judi talked about the value of just stepping back for a minute, you know, where a minute might be 2 weeks in real time, and talking about how you think about your organization, and, you know, doing that discovery work at that widest level. What always makes me nervous when I hear words like, or terms, is MVP a word? Anyway, terms like MVP is that people will go, cool, let's do a point solution. And so again, if we take it back to IT jargon, you know, a point solution is where you're just trying to solve one problem.
Yeah.
And it's a known bad thing. People go, don't do point solutions, because, and the because is usually overall the expenses involved or the opportunities lost because of lack of interoperability or whatever, you know, that totally outweigh the benefits of fixing that one problem at the time. So,
but not for those people right now.
Correct. Yeah. And so this is like, to me, this is a clear tension that will never be resolved. Like, it's one of those things that we must demonstrate value, and we must demonstrate value quickly. Otherwise we get shelved, you know, like, and this is the case, Judi, you talked about, you both talked about implementation projects where, I mean, the reality is that often people are trying to establish an information architecture to implement it within a system at the time that they're delivering that system.
True.
And so the kind of UX ideas around testing and, you know, basically understanding whether or not you're delivering something that actually works for people, you know, they do fall by the wayside. But also what I've seen is this perception that you're not delivering value fast enough. Like, why are you taking ages to roll out a technology? We've already procured the damn thing. You know, your IT people are asking you, well, why can't you just turn it on? And we have to have clear answers for that if we're not going to just turn it on.
But I think quality. I think quality gives us a clear answer there, though, too. Nice. And I think being quality sensitive can help with that, because if we can say, well, okay, we can implement it now, and we can achieve this level of quality.
Yeah, for sure.
But
and what I would say is also, like, the flip side, right? Because I'm trying to say that, you know, on one hand, we need to do stuff that does solve a problem in terms of sort of a point solution, you know, does actually solve a problem for a particular part of the business, or, you know, or a process or whatever. But on the other side, if we run around only solving each sort of problem as we identify it, then the overall costs involved and the overall kind of feasibility of the end result might be completely compromised. And I think that's a thing that's really hard when we're thinking about design and about systems and about architecture, you know, and about structuring stuff, is that if we can think big and we can think organization wide and we can spend some time and effort into doing that, then we reduce the risk that any of those specific problems we're trying to solve have to get solved over and over. But there's always going to be that tension. If we spend all this time just thinking big about stuff, you get nothing done, basically. I mean, you deliver no benefit. So I like the idea of an MVP, and I think lots of discussion needs to be had around what we mean by it. You know, what's actually viable? What's actually viable?
But there's I mean, I think, yeah, God, yeah. I mean, actually, now I'm really thinking about what you're saying with viability. I think that's, I think you're spot on. I think there's an interesting question for us though, as consulting organizations too. I've got a friend of mine who, is a high-powered consultant in management consultant in the UK, and the thing he always talks about is sense making, decision making, and action taking. And it's the sense making is the bit that people want to chop off, or that that no one wants to do, or that an organization wants to outsource to consultants. And that's actually one of those things that I think is really interesting for us as consultants, because what you're talking about is making sense of the organization broadly and the problems that it's facing, and so that you can implement a holistic solution, that's more likely to solve more problems, as opposed to solving a tiny problem in this domain and causing another problem down the road. But as consultants, people bring us in after they've made a decision and they want us to take action. And so how do you, this is something that I constantly think about. It's this idea of making people quality sensitive, but how do you also then, how do you build the sense making capacity of an organization so that and I mean, I guess this is interesting too, because organizations are probably, most of them aren't going to have enough money to hire a full, or stuff to do to hire a full-time information architect. But how do we build that sense-making capacity so that, what we're getting as consultants are, fully formed ideas that they need help implementing?
Sure.
And I think I know that's a little bit nebulous and a little bit vague, but I really think there's something there, and one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast as well is so that we can talk about this stuff, because I think there's and we touched on this a little bit as well. We were talking about the lack of information management education. The fact that lots of universities are dropping their information management courses, and it's starting to come back to service providers like my organization, and we do short courses for people that help them learn how to do a specific thing, but we don't teach them the big broad holistic skills that you need 6 months, 12 months. You need a university degree type education, or 20 years of on-the-job experience with other people who think at the right level to get. I mean, how do we solve that problem? Because to me, what you learn with those things is all of the sense making,
I think,
so that you can understand the problems.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just very quickly, I'll just note that while you're saying that, I thought actually it's another parallel with IT, where the kind of idea of computer science as an academic practice is pretty much getting shelved in favor of, I need to learn to program Java or, whatever. And again, it's like specific skills-based training delivery to, do a particular task, but it doesn't give you a set of ways of thinking about stuff, or, as you say, making sense of something. Yeah. So again, another parallel between IM and IT.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought of that, but I think you're spot on too.